London had a particular way of forgetting women. It did not shout them down or drag them from the room. It simply stopped saying their names. It let the silence do the work, the way frost works on a stone wall, slow and sure and absolute. And in the spring of 1841, on the morning of her wedding, Lady Vivian Ashford understood this with the kind of cold clarity that arrives only when you have been handed a beautiful dress and told it is your coffin. She stood in the dressing room of a house that did not belong to her, wearing a gown of ivory silk that had been chosen by a woman she had never met, sewn by hands she would never thank, and paid for by a man who had not spoken her name once in the 3 weeks since he proposed. The Duke of Hargrove, Edward Sinclair, a man the papers called untouchable, unknowable, carved from the same grey stone as the ancestral estate that swallowed the northern skyline of Hampshire. He had proposed to her in a study that smelled of ink and cedar, with the door open and a solicitor standing in the hall, as though the entire affair were a property transfer rather than a promise. Which, of course, it was. Her father had lost everything. Not in the dramatic, gossip-worthy way that might have earned sympathy. Not at cards, not on horses, not in a duel over a woman's honor. He had simply been a kind man in an unkind economy, had signed the wrong papers for the wrong people, and had woken one January morning to find that the house he had raised his daughters in now belonged to a bank. Vivian, the eldest, had been given a choice that was not a choice at all. Marry Hargrove, who needed a wife to satisfy the terms of a family trust, or watch her mother and younger sisters be turned onto the street. She had signed the contract the same afternoon. She had not cried, because crying required believing that someone might hear you. Now she stood before the mirror and looked at herself with the detached attention of a woman examining a painting she did not particularly admire. 23 years old, auburn hair pinned into an arrangement that was meant to suggest elegance, but felt like armor. Green eyes that had, until recently, been her most remarked upon feature, though no one would remark on them again, because no one would be looking. That was the entire point. Edward Sinclair was not marrying her to be seen. He was marrying her to close a clause in a dead man's will. And once the clause was closed, he would return to his life in Hampshire, and she would remain in the London townhouse, and the silence would settle over her like snow, and she would become one of those women whose names the city simply stopped saying. She understood this. She accepted it. She had been raised to be practical above all things, and this was the most practical decision she had ever made. What she did not understand, what no one in London would understand for quite some time, was that the silence would not settle. That the woman they had all agreed to forget would become the woman none of them could afford to ignore. That within 2 years, the name Vivian Sinclair, Duchess of Hargrove, would be spoken in drawing rooms and parliament halls and the private offices of the most powerful men in England, with a mixture of fury and fascination, and something very close to fear. But that is later. That is the middle and the end of the story. And we are still at the beginning, still in the dressing room, still watching Vivian pin the last curl into place, and turn from the mirror with steady hands and a heart beating so fast she could feel it in her teeth. The wedding was held at St. George's, Hanover Square, on a Tuesday morning in April, when the sky was the colour of old pewter and the trees along the square were just beginning to bud. There were 42 guests. Vivian's mother wept quietly in the third pew, clutching the hand of Vivian's youngest sister, Rosalind, who was 14 and furious, and had not spoken to Vivian in 4 days because she believed, with the absolute conviction of youth, that her older sister was sacrificing herself, and that sacrifice was something to be fought rather than endured. The Duke arrived 7 minutes late. He entered through the side door rather than the front, which caused a brief murmur among the guests that he silenced simply by walking forward. He was tall. That was the first thing anyone ever said about Edward Sinclair, because it was the easiest thing to say, and it postponed the harder observations. He was tall and lean, and moved with the particular economy of a man who had learned early that the world would watch him, whether he wanted it to or not, and had decided to give it as little to watch as possible. His hair was dark, almost black, cut close. His face was the kind that portrait painters called distinguished, and everyone else called difficult. All sharp angles and deep-set eyes the color of iron. He wore black, because he always wore black, because color was a kind of announcement, and Edward Sinclair had stopped making announcements years ago. He did not look at Vivian as he took his place at the altar. He looked at the vicar, and at the stained glass window behind the vicar's head, and at a point somewhere above and beyond all of them, as though he were already calculating the fastest route back to his study. The ceremony took 11 minutes. When the vicar said, "You may kiss the bride," Edward turned to Vivian for the first time, and she saw his eyes up close. They were not simply grey. They were the grey of storm clouds seen from a long distance, the grey of a winter sea before it froze, and they held absolutely nothing. No warmth, no cruelty, no curiosity, just a vast, practiced emptiness, like a room that had been cleared of all its furniture years ago and left to gather dust. He kissed her forehead, not her lips, her forehead, the way you might press a seal onto a letter you did not particularly wish to send. And then he stepped back, and the guests applauded politely, and Vivian thought, so this is how it begins. Not with a door closing, but with the sound of no one opening one. The wedding breakfast was held at the Hargrove townhouse on Grosvenor Square, a building so large and so deliberately imposing that it seemed to have been designed not as a home, but as an argument against intimacy. The ceilings were 20 feet high. The walls were lined with portraits of Sinclair ancestors, who stared down from their gilded frames with expressions of collective disapproval, as though the entire family had been painted mid-judgment. The dining table seated 30 and was set for 20, which meant there were 10 empty chairs arranged along its length, like witnesses at a trial where no one had agreed to testify. Vivian sat at one end, Edward sat at the other. Between them stretched a continent of white linen and silver candlesticks, and silence. The guests talked among themselves. They talked about the weather, which was grey. They talked about the new opera season, which was promising. They talked about everything, except what they were all thinking, which was that the Duke of Hargrove had married a woman he clearly intended to store like a piece of furniture, and that the woman in question was sitting very straight in her chair and eating her soup with the precise, unhurried movements of someone who had decided that if she was going to be ignored, she would at least be ignored with excellent posture. It was Edward's younger brother, Thomas, who broke the pattern. Thomas Sinclair was 26, sandy-haired, quick to smile, and possessed of the particular social grace that comes from having spent a lifetime watching someone else be admired and deciding that warmth was more interesting than grandeur. He appeared at Vivian's side between the second and third courses, carrying a glass of champagne he clearly did not need, and wearing an expression of genuine friendliness that was so unexpected it nearly startled her. "You're doing remarkably well," he said, pulling out the chair beside her without waiting for permission. Vivian looked at him. "I'm eating soup." "Yes, but you're eating it with such determination. It's quite inspiring." She felt something shift in her chest. Not warmth, exactly, but the memory of warmth. The way a cold room remembers the fire that once burned in its hearth. "Is this the part where you tell me your brother is a good man underneath it all?" Thomas considered this. "No," he said. "This is the part where I tell you that the library on the second floor has a window seat with a view of the garden, and the cook, Mrs. Harlow, will bring you tea and cake at 4 o'clock every afternoon without being asked. And the household staff are the finest people you will ever meet, even if the man who employs them has the emotional range of a writing desk." A writing desk. I'm being generous. A writing desk at least has drawers. One might find something unexpected inside. Vivian almost smiled. Almost. "And your brother has no drawers?" "My brother," Thomas said, and his voice shifted, the lightness thinning just enough to let something real show through, "has a great many drawers. He simply locked them all a long time ago, and threw the keys into a very deep lake. He paused. But he is not cruel. I need you to know that. Whatever else happens, whatever this arrangement is or isn't, he is not a cruel man. He is a man who has forgotten how to be anything else but alone. Vivian held his gaze for a long moment. Then she lifted her champagne glass and said, "2 draws." And Thomas laughed, and it was the only genuine laugh anyone heard at the wedding breakfast of the Duke and Duchess of Hargrove. The first 3 months of the marriage were exactly what Vivian had expected, which was the loneliest thing about them. Edward departed for Hampshire the morning after the wedding. He did not say goodbye. He left a note on the hallway table, written in handwriting so controlled it looked like it had been produced by a machine, informing her that the household accounts were managed by Mr. Pemberton, the steward, and that she was welcome to use the carriage and the library and the gardens, and that he would return to London when business required it. Business. As though she were a shipping route or a parliamentary vote. She read the note twice, folded it, and placed it in the top drawer of the writing desk in the morning room. Then she stood very still for a full minute, feeling the silence of the house settle around her like water filling a basin. And she made a decision. She did not make it dramatically. She did not clench her fists, or set her jaw, or stare out the window with blazing defiance. She simply decided, in the quiet, unremarkable way that the most important decisions are always made, that she would not disappear. She did not yet know what this meant. She did not have a plan, or a vision, or a burning cause. She simply knew, in some deep and wordless part of herself, that she had spent her entire life being practical, being sensible, being the daughter who held things together while everything fell apart, and that she had earned the right to be something more than a clause in a dead man's will. The townhouse on Grosvenor Square became her laboratory. She began with the household, because the household was what was in front of her, and Vivian had always believed that you changed the world by changing what was in front of you. She met with Mrs. Harlow, the cook, a woman of 50 with flour-dusted hands and eyes that missed nothing. She met with Pemberton, the steward, a thin, precise man who had managed the Sinclair properties for 15 years and who regarded her with the polite wariness of someone expecting to be either ignored or overruled. She met with the maids, the footman, the gardener, the stable hand. She learned their names. She asked about their families. She sat in the kitchen one evening while Mrs. Harlow made bread and told her about the time the old Duke, Edward's father, had once eaten an entire tray of lemon tarts meant for a dinner party of 20 and blamed it on the dog. And Vivian laughed, really laughed, for the first time since her father had lost the house. She learned the rhythms of the house, the way a musician learns a new instrument, by listening, by watching, by letting her fingers find the keys. She discovered that the second-floor library was exactly as Thomas had described it, a room of tall windows and deep chairs, and shelves that climbed to the ceiling, filled with books that ranged from ancient Greek philosophy to modern agricultural theory, to a surprising collection of poetry that someone, at some point, had loved enough to annotate in the margins in a hand she did not recognize. She spent hours there, reading. She had always read, but reading had always been a luxury stolen between responsibilities. Now it became her education, her conversation, her companion. She read histories of England and France and the revolutions that had reshaped them. She read political essays on trade and labor and the condition of the working poor. She read novels that made her weep and philosophy that made her argue with the page. And she began, quietly and without announcement, to venture out. London in 1841 was a city that ran on 2 systems simultaneously. There was the visible system, the one that appeared in the society pages, the one made of balls and operas and afternoon calls, where women traded pleasantries over tea and men made deals over port, and everyone agreed that the world was arranged exactly as it should be. And then there was the invisible system, the one that powered the city from below, the vast machinery of labor and poverty and need that kept the chandeliers lit and the streets swept and the carriages rolling. And that was discussed in polite company only when it could be safely pitied from a distance. Vivian discovered the invisible system by accident. She was walking in Mayfair one morning, unaccompanied because she had no one to accompany her, and had quickly decided that this was a freedom rather than a humiliation, when she turned down a side street and found a woman sitting on the steps of a church with 2 children pressed against her sides and an expression on her face that Vivian recognized immediately. It was the expression of someone who had run out of practical options and was now operating on nothing but the stubborn, animal refusal to stop breathing. The woman's name was Margaret Hale. She was 28. Her husband had worked at a textile factory in Whitechapel until a machine had crushed his hand, after which he had been dismissed without a penny of compensation, after which he had taken to drink, after which he had simply vanished, leaving Margaret with 2 children, no income, and a room in a boarding house whose landlord had given her until Friday. Vivian did not give her money. She sat down on the church steps beside her in her fine silk dress and said, "Tell me everything." And Margaret, startled and suspicious and desperate enough to trust a stranger, told her everything. It was the first conversation of what would become hundreds. Vivian returned to that neighborhood and then to others. She visited Whitechapel and Bethnal Green and Southwark. She walked through streets where the air was thick with coal smoke and the sound of children's laughter and the smells of boiling cabbage and horse dung and the particular, unmistakable scent of too many people living in too small a space. She talked to women, because the women were the ones who would talk to her, the ones who held the families together, who knew where every penny went and what it cost to keep a child fed and a roof overhead. She did not go as a duchess. She did not arrive in a carriage or announce her title. She went in a plain dress and a wool coat, with her hair pinned simply, and she listened. She listened to stories of factories that worked children 12 hours a day, of landlords who charged a week's wages for a room with a leaking roof, of hospitals that turned away the poor, of schools that existed on paper but not in reality. She listened, and she wrote it all down in a leather notebook she carried in her coat pocket, filling page after page in her small, steady hand. And then she did something that no one expected, least of all herself. She began to use it. It started with Margaret Hale. Vivian found her a position in a dressmaker's shop on Bond Street, not through charity, but through a careful, strategic conversation with the shop's owner, a Frenchwoman named Madame Leclerc, in which Vivian pointed out that Margaret was a skilled seamstress, that the shop was understaffed, and that the Duchess of Hargrove would be happy to bring her custom to a business that employed women of character and talent. Madame Leclerc, who was no fool, hired Margaret the following morning. 1 placement became 2. 2 became 5. 5 became a system. Vivian mapped the network of women she had met, their skills, their needs, their circumstances, and she began to connect them, not with money, but with opportunity. She introduced a woman who could cook to a household that needed a cook. She connected a woman who could read and write with a school that needed a teacher. She brought together a group of women who sewed for pennies in their homes and helped them negotiate collectively with a factory owner who had been paying them a fraction of what their work was worth. She discovered, with a mixture of surprise and recognition, that she was extraordinarily good at this. Not because she was kind, though she was. Not because she was brave, though she was that too. But because she had spent her entire life watching, observing, cataloging the invisible mechanics of how people and systems worked. And now she was turning that observation into action. She understood power, not because she had ever held it, but because she had spent 23 years being subject to it, and she knew its architecture from the inside, the way a prisoner knows every stone of the walls that hold them. Word spread, slowly at first, in the quiet way that real things spread, not through announcements, but through results. Women in the East End began to know her name, not as the Duchess of Hargrove, but as the woman who listened, who wrote things down, who came back. They called her Mrs. Sinclair, because a title felt too distant and a first name felt too familiar, and the compromise sat well with everyone. It was 6 months after the wedding when Edward returned to London. He arrived without warning on a Thursday evening in October, stepping through the front door of the Grosvenor Square townhouse with the same quiet, contained presence he carried everywhere, as though the air itself knew to make room for him. He wore a dark travelling coat, still damp from rain, and his face carried the particular weariness of a man who has spent the day in a carriage thinking thoughts he did not enjoy. Pemberton met him in the foyer. "Your Grace, we were not expecting you." "Evidently," Edward said, glancing at the hallway table where a stack of correspondence sat neatly arranged beside a small vase of yellow chrysanthemums that had certainly not been there when he left. "Where is the Duchess?" Pemberton hesitated. It was the smallest hesitation, barely a breath, but Edward noticed it, because Edward noticed everything, which was both his gift and his particular form of torture. "Her Grace is in the library, Your Grace. She has visitors." "Visitors?" "Yes, Your Grace. She has visitors most afternoons." Edward climbed the stairs without removing his coat. He could hear voices before he reached the second-floor landing, which was itself unusual, because the library had always been the quietest room in the house, the room where his father had gone to escape, and his grandfather before that, and Edward himself on the rare occasions he stayed in London. It was supposed to be a room of silence and solitude. It was not supposed to be a room of visitors. He opened the door. The library looked different, not structurally, not in any way he could immediately name, but different in the way a room changes when someone has decided to live in it, rather than merely occupy it. The curtains were pulled back. Late afternoon light, amber and warm, fell across the carpet and the shelves, and the long table that had been moved from against the wall to the center of the room, and was now covered with papers, notebooks, ledgers, and what appeared to be a very detailed map of East London, with pins stuck into it at various points. Vivian was standing at the head of the table. She wore a deep blue dress with ink stains on the cuffs. Her hair was half up and half falling, as though she had pinned it quickly and without a mirror. There were 3 other women in the room. One was Mrs. Harlow, the cook, who was seated in a chair by the fire with a cup of tea, watching the proceedings with the calm alertness of a woman who had decided that this was far more interesting than anything happening in the kitchen. The second was a woman Edward did not recognize, tall and dark-haired, wearing a plain dress and taking notes in a ledger with fierce concentration. The third was a young woman in a grey coat who was speaking rapidly about something involving building inspectors and lease agreements, and who stopped mid-sentence when she saw Edward in the doorway. The room went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a pause, but the electric quiet of a space that has been interrupted by an authority it was not expecting. Vivian looked up. Their eyes met across the table, across the papers and the pins, and the 6 months of silence that lay between them like a fallen tree across a path. She did not startle. She did not blush or stammer or rush to explain herself. She looked at him with the steady, clear attention of a woman who had spent 6 months building something real and was not about to apologize for it. "Your Grace," she said. "Welcome home." The words were perfectly polite and completely devastating. Home. As though the word belonged to both of them. As though he had any right to it. Edward stood in the doorway for a moment that lasted much longer than a moment, looking at this woman he had married and immediately set aside, like a book he did not intend to read. And for the first time in years, he felt something he could not immediately categorize. Not anger, not annoyance, something more unsettling than either. The faint, treacherous stirring of curiosity. "What is this?" he said. Vivian held his gaze. "This is work," she said, and then, because she had learned in 6 months that the best way to handle power was to behave as though you had every right to your own, she turned back to the young woman in the grey coat and said, "Please continue, Miss Dawes." Miss Dawes looked from Vivian to Edward and back again, uncertain. Vivian gave her a small nod. Miss Dawes continued. Edward remained in the doorway, listening to a conversation about building codes and tenant rights, and the particular cruelty of a landlord named Barton, who owned 14 properties in Bethnal Green and had not repaired a single roof in 3 years. And he realized, with a slowness that embarrassed him, that his wife had become someone entirely different from the quiet, practical woman he had signed a contract with in a cedar-scented study 6 months ago. Or perhaps she had always been this person. Perhaps he had simply never looked. He left the doorway without speaking. He went to his study on the ground floor, the room he had always used when he was in London, and he sat in his chair behind his desk and stared at the wall and tried to understand why the sight of Vivian Sinclair, standing at the head of a table covered in maps and papers, with ink on her cuffs and authority in her voice, had produced in him a sensation he had not felt in years. It was not irritation. It was not disapproval. It was, and this was the part that frightened him, admiration. He stayed in London for 3 days. During those 3 days, he observed his wife the way a man observes weather from behind glass, aware that something powerful was happening, but not yet ready to step into it. He saw her leave the house each morning, carrying a leather notebook and wearing the plain wool coat. He saw her return each afternoon, with the notebook full and her eyes bright, with the particular energy of someone who has spent the day doing exactly what they were born to do. He saw her meet with Pemberton about household accounts, and he noticed that she asked questions he had never thought to ask, and made suggestions that were, without exception, sensible and occasionally brilliant. He saw Thomas visit, and he heard their laughter from 2 rooms away, and he felt something he refused to name tighten in his chest. On the second evening, he found himself in the library after dinner, not because he had planned to go there, but because his feet carried him there the way they always had, and he discovered that the room had become, in his absence, unmistakably hers. Not in the obvious way of redecoration or rearrangement, but in the subtle, accumulative way that a person leaves their impression on a space simply by caring about it. There were fresh flowers on the windowsill. There were bookmarks in volumes he had never opened. There was a shawl draped over the back of the window seat, deep green, and when he picked it up without thinking, it smelled of lavender and something warmer beneath. Something he did not recognize, but that his body responded to before his mind could intervene. He put the shawl down. He turned to leave, and Vivian was in the doorway. She wore a simple evening dress the color of claret. Her hair was loose, falling over her shoulders in the way it did when she had pulled out the pins at the end of a long day. She looked tired and beautiful, and entirely uninterested in performing either fatigue or beauty for his benefit. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said. The words came out stiff, formal, as though they had been starched along with his shirt. "It's your library," she said. "It appears to have become yours." Something shifted in her expression. Not offense, not exactly. More like the flicker of a candle when a door opens. "Would you like me to move my things?" "No." The word was out before he could measure it, quick and unguarded, and it surprised them both. He corrected course immediately, pulling formality around him like a coat. "No, that won't be necessary. You should use the space as you see fit." She studied him. He had the uncomfortable sensation of being read, not the way a society matron reads a man, calculating his value and his connections, but the way a scholar reads a text, looking for the meaning beneath the surface. "Thank you," she said, and then, because Vivian had never been able to leave a silence unfilled when there was something worth saying, "Your brother tells me you used to write poetry." The words landed like ice water. Edward felt every muscle in his body tighten. "Thomas talks too much." "Thomas is the only person in this family who talks at all." The observation was so precise, so calmly delivered, that it cut through every defense he had. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since the wedding. Green eyes, auburn hair, a face that was not beautiful in the way society measured beauty, not delicate, not ornamental, but beautiful in the way that certain landscapes are beautiful, with a strength and a clarity that demanded attention rather than requesting it. "I used to do a great many things," he said quietly. And then, because he could feel the conversation moving toward territory he had sealed off years ago, he walked past her through the doorway, close enough that his sleeve brushed her arm, and the contact, the smallest possible contact, sent a current through him that he felt in his spine. He left London the following morning. He did not leave a note this time. He simply left. But something had changed. Something small and quiet and impossible to undo. He had seen her. Not the practical woman he had married, not the clause in his father's will, but the actual, living, breathing, fierce, extraordinary person who had taken the silence he had wrapped around her and turned it into a stage. And he could not stop thinking about her. In Hampshire, on his estate that stretched across 3,000 acres of rolling green and ancient oak, Edward Sinclair tried to resume his life. He rose at dawn. He rode. He reviewed accounts with his land agent. He ate meals alone at a table set for one, in a dining room where the only sound was the tick of the clock and the clink of his fork against the plate, and the vast, echoing silence that he had once found peaceful, and now found, for reasons he refused to examine, unbearable. He thought about her hands, the ink stains on her cuffs, the way she had said, "Please continue, Miss Dawes," as though his appearance in a room he owned was an interruption to be managed, rather than an authority to be deferred to. He thought about her eyes, the steadiness in them, the absolute refusal to be embarrassed or diminished. He thought about the shawl that smelled of lavender. He thought about his sleeve brushing her arm in the doorway, the electric fraction of a second that had lasted, in his memory, for hours. He did not write to her. He told himself this was because there was nothing to say. He told himself the arrangement was working exactly as intended. He told himself that curiosity was not the same as caring, and that admiration was not the same as want, and that the restlessness he felt at 3 o'clock in the morning, when sleep refused to come, and his mind insisted on replaying the sound of her voice saying, "Welcome home," was simply the weather changing. Meanwhile, in London, Vivian's work was growing. The network she had built, quietly, one woman at a time, one placement at a time, one negotiation at a time, had reached a kind of critical mass. She was no longer simply finding positions for individuals. She was identifying patterns. She saw that the same landlords appeared in story after story. She saw that the same factory owners exploited the same legal loopholes. She saw that the system of poor relief was designed not to lift people out of poverty, but to keep them just desperate enough to accept whatever wages were offered. And she began, with the meticulous attention to detail that had always been her nature and was now her weapon, to document it all. Her leather notebook became a ledger. The ledger became a file. The file became an archive. She recorded names, dates, addresses, amounts. She tracked which factories violated safety regulations. She mapped which properties were unfit for habitation. She catalogued which parish officials were taking bribes to look the other way. She did this not with the righteous fury of a crusader, but with the calm, relentless precision of a bookkeeper, because she understood that fury burned itself out, but facts endured. And then she did the thing that made her dangerous. She began to share the facts with people who could use them. It started with a journalist. Henry Blackwell wrote for a small but respected publication called The London Examiner, a paper that survived on subscriptions rather than advertising, and was therefore free to publish things that made powerful people uncomfortable. Vivian met him through Thomas, who had a gift for knowing exactly the kind of people his brother would disapprove of. Blackwell was 30, sharp-featured, intensely serious, and possessed of the particular zeal of a man who believed that the truth, properly presented, could move mountains. Vivian gave him facts. She gave him the landlord in Bethnal Green, the one named Barton, with his 14 properties and his unrepaired roofs, and the family of 7 who had nearly died when a ceiling collapsed. Blackwell published the story. Barton was investigated. 3 of his properties were condemned. The family was relocated. And something shifted in the invisible machinery of London. A gear turning that had been stuck for years. And the people who controlled that machinery looked up from their ledgers with the uneasy sensation of being watched. They did not yet know who was watching them. That came later. The second article was about a textile factory in Whitechapel that employed women for 16 hours a day at wages that would not have fed a dog. The third was about a workhouse master who was selling the labor of his charges to private contractors and pocketing the difference. The fourth was about a member of Parliament who owned slum properties in 3 boroughs and sat on the committee responsible for housing reform. Each article was factual. Each was meticulously sourced. Each landed with the quiet, devastating impact of a stone dropped into still water. The splash modest, but the ripples reaching every shore. And each article was built on information that had come, through channels that were carefully, deliberately untraceable, from the Duchess of Hargrove. Vivian understood something that most people who wanted to change the world did not. She understood that power did not listen to passion. Power listened to leverage. And leverage came from knowing things that powerful people did not want known, and making it clear, without threats, without drama, simply through the steady, unstoppable publication of documented truth, that the cost of continuing as they were would be higher than the cost of changing. She also understood something about her own position, but was both a limitation and a weapon. She was a duchess. This meant that she could go places a common woman could not. She could sit in drawing rooms with the wives of factory owners and landowners and politicians, and she could listen to their complaints and their boasts and their unguarded observations, and she could catalogue every useful thing they said. She could attend charitable functions and meet the men who sat on boards and committees, and she could ask questions that seemed innocent and were anything but. She could move between the visible and invisible systems of London because she existed in both, a woman of title and no power, a duchess and a ghost. And no one paid attention to a ghost. No one except the people she was helping, and, increasingly, the people she was exposing. It was in December, 8 months after the wedding, that Vivian received a letter from Hampshire. It was addressed in Edward's precise, mechanical handwriting, and it contained a single line. "I will be in London on the 14th. Please arrange dinner." Please arrange dinner. As though she were a housekeeper. As though the word please made it something other than an order. She arranged dinner. She arranged it beautifully, because she was a woman who did things properly or not at all, and because some part of her, some stubborn, illogical part that she could not argue into silence, wanted him to see what she was capable of. The dining table was set for 2. The candles were beeswax, the linens were Irish, the wine was a Burgundy that Pemberton recommended with the quiet authority of a man who understood that excellent wine could accomplish what conversation could not. Mrs. Harlow prepared a meal of roasted lamb with rosemary and root vegetables and a lemon cake for dessert that was, by any honest assessment, a small work of art. Edward arrived at 7:30. He was wearing a dark suit rather than his traveling clothes, which meant he had changed, which meant he had thought about what he would wear, which meant something, though Vivian was not sure what. They sat across from each other at a table that was suddenly, acutely intimate, in a way the 40-person table at the wedding breakfast had not been. The candles threw warm light across the white linen and the silver and the space between them, which was 3 feet of mahogany and a lifetime of things unsaid. "Thank you for arranging this," Edward said. "You asked me to." "I did." Silence. The kind that has weight and texture, like fabric. "How is Hampshire?" Vivian asked. "Green." He paused. "Quiet." "Is quiet what you prefer?" He looked at her across the candles. The light caught the silver flecks in his grey eyes, and for just a moment, they did not look empty. They looked like a night sky. "I used to," he said. The meal proceeded. They talked about practical things: the estate, the townhouse, the accounts. Edward asked about the household, and Vivian reported with the same calm competence she brought to everything. And he listened with an attention that was, she realized, more focused than it had been in October. He was not just hearing her, he was studying her, the way she studied the systems she had set out to change, with the careful, analytical attention of someone trying to understand something they had previously dismissed. It was over the lemon cake that things shifted. "Thomas tells me you've been busy," Edward said, and there was something in his voice. Not accusation, not exactly, but a kind of cautious probing, like a man testing the ice on a frozen lake. "Thomas talks too much," Vivian said, echoing his own words from October. And something happened to Edward's face. It was not a smile. A smile would have been too much, too quickly. It was the faintest relaxation of the muscles around his eyes, the barest softening of the line of his jaw, as though a door somewhere deep inside him had been nudged open a crack. "He told me about the articles," Edward said. Vivian set down her fork. "Did he?" "He did. He told me a great deal. He told me about the women, the placements, the notebook, the journalist." Edward's voice was measured, controlled, the voice of a man choosing each word with surgical precision. "He told me that the Duchess of Hargrove has become something of a figure in certain circles." Certain circles. The ones that don't appear in the society pages. Vivian held his gaze. She felt, for the first time in his presence, not nervous, but alert. The way she felt at the beginning of a negotiation, when the outcome was genuinely uncertain, and everything depended on what happened next. "Are you angry?" He was quiet for a long time. The candles flickered. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed 9. "No," he said. And then, more quietly, as though the word cost him something, "Impressed." The word hung in the air between them like a spark. Vivian felt it land in her chest, warm and unexpected. And she did not trust it, because she had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing a woman could do was believe that a powerful man's approval meant safety. "I don't need your approval," she said. "I know," Edward said. "That's what's impressive." They looked at each other across the table. The candles burned. The lemon cake sat untouched between them. And something passed between them that was not words, was not touch, was not anything that could be named or held, but that both of them felt with the unmistakable certainty of two people who have just discovered that the stranger across the table might not be a stranger at all. Edward left for Hampshire the following morning, but this time he left a note. It was short. It said, "The lemon cake was extraordinary," and beneath that, in handwriting that was fractionally less controlled than his usual, "I will return in January." Vivian read the note 3 times. Then she placed it in the drawer of the writing desk beside the first note, and she went to work. January arrived wrapped in frost. London shivered under a sky the colour of tin, and the Thames moved slowly between its banks, dark and cold, and glittering with the reflected light of gas lamps on the bridges. Vivian had not slowed down, she had accelerated. The network of women she supported had grown to nearly 200, connected by a web of mutual aid, shared information, and the fierce, pragmatic solidarity of people who had learned that no one was coming to rescue them, and had decided to rescue each other. The articles in the London Examiner had attracted attention. The right kind, and the wrong kind. Henry Blackwell had been threatened twice, once by a lawyer representing the slum landlord, and once by a man who had simply appeared at his office door, said nothing, and left a dead bird on his desk. Blackwell, who had the constitution of a man who had been doing this for years, had fed the bird to a stray cat and published the next article anyway. But the threats were escalating. Vivian understood this. She understood that what she had built was no longer a charity or a hobby or a duchess playing at reform. It was a genuine threat to the financial interests of men who had a great deal of money and very little conscience. and who would not tolerate being exposed indefinitely. It was Thomas who brought the warning. He appeared at the townhouse on a Tuesday afternoon in January, his usual warmth replaced by an urgency that made him look, for the first time, like his brother. "There's a man named Alderton," he said, standing in the library, not sitting, which told Vivian everything about how serious this was. "Sir Philip Alderton. He owns factories, properties, shipping interests. He sits on 3 parliamentary committees, and he is very, very angry about the article that was published last week." "The one about child labor in his mills," Vivian said. "That one, yes. Everything in that article was true. I don't doubt it, but Alderton is not the kind of man who is interested in truth. He is interested in making problems disappear. And you, Vivian, have become a problem." She heard her first name in his mouth and felt a flash of gratitude for his friendship. This bright, warm man who had been, in many ways, the only family her marriage had given her. "What is he going to do?" Thomas ran a hand through his sandy hair. "He's going to find out where the information is coming from. He has resources. He has connections. He has people in Parliament, people in the press, people in the police force. If he traces the articles back to you, he won't attack you directly. He's too clever for that. But he will attack you through Edward. He'll call in debts. He'll threaten the Sinclair interests. He'll make it politically and financially devastating for the Hargrove name to be associated with reform. And he'll force Edward to choose between his estate and his wife's cause." "And you think Edward will choose the estate?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I think Edward doesn't know what's happening. And I think he deserves to." Vivian turned to the window. Outside, the January sky pressed down on London like a grey hand. She thought about the women in her network, the hundreds of lives that had been changed, the work that still needed to be done. She thought about Margaret Hale, who was now the head seamstress at Madame Leclerc's, and who had, just last week, moved her children into a proper flat with windows that opened and a door that locked. She thought about the archive of facts she had built, the meticulous record of exploitation and abuse that existed because she had listened and written it down and refused to look away. And she thought about Edward, the grey eyes that had held nothing, and then had held, just for a moment, admiration. The note about the lemon cake, the fractionally loosened handwriting, the faintest, most tentative crack in the fortress of his solitude. "I'll tell him," she said. Edward arrived in London 3 days later. He did not come because she asked. He came because Thomas had written to him, which Vivian discovered only when Edward walked through the front door with a face like a thundercloud, and eyes that, for the first time since she had known him, were not empty. They were furious. He found her in the library. She was sitting at the table, her notebooks spread before her, because she had decided that if this was going to happen, it would happen here, in the room where she had built everything that mattered, and she would not hide a single page. He stood in the doorway. He was breathing hard, not from exertion, but from the effort of containing whatever was moving through him. His jaw was clenched. His hands were fists at his sides. He looked at the table, at the notebooks, at the map with its pins, at the stack of newspaper clippings, and she watched his face as he understood, piece by piece, the scope of what she had done. "How long?" he said. His voice was low, tight, controlled the way a bridge is controlled when it is carrying more weight than it was designed to bear. "From the beginning," she said. "From the beginning." He repeated it the way you repeat a sentence in a foreign language, trying to find its meaning. "You have been doing this since the day I left." "Since the day you left me in an empty house with nothing but a note and a steward," Vivian said, and there was heat in her voice now. The first real heat she had ever shown him, and it shocked them both. "Yes, since that day. Do you understand what you've done? I've documented the truth. You've painted a target on this family." His voice cracked, just slightly, on the word family, and she heard it. Heard the fracture beneath the fury. And she understood suddenly and completely that his anger was not about politics or reputation or financial risk. It was about fear. He was afraid, not of Alderton, not of scandal, but of the fact that this woman he had married and tried to forget had placed herself in danger, and he could not protect her because he had not been here, and he had not been here because he had chosen not to be. And the weight of that choice was crushing him. "Say what you actually mean," Vivian said quietly. He stared at her. The fury wavered. Beneath it, something raw and painful surfaced, like a wound exposed when a bandage is torn away. "I mean," he said, and his voice was different now, lower, rougher, stripped of its control. "That Thomas told me there are men who want to silence you, and I cannot." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I cannot bear that." The words landed like a hand offered across a great distance. Vivian felt them in her chest, felt them rearrange something she had thought was settled, and she stood, slowly, and walked around the table until she was standing in front of him, close enough to see the pulse in his throat and the tension in his shoulders, and the way his grey eyes, those empty, fortress eyes, were now full of something so vulnerable it made her want to weep. "Then stay," she said. 2 words. The simplest sentence in the English language. And Edward Sinclair, the Duke of Hargrove, the man who had built his entire adult life on the principle of not needing anyone, felt them break something inside him that had been frozen for a very long time. He did not answer, not in words. He lifted his hand, slowly, as though it cost him everything, and touched her face. Just his fingertips against her cheek. The lightest possible contact. And Vivian closed her eyes, because the gentleness of it, the terrifying, overwhelming gentleness of a man who had forgotten how to be gentle and was trying to remember, was more than she could hold while looking at him. They stood like that for a long time, his fingers against her cheek, her eyes closed. The library quiet around them, the notebooks and the maps and the evidence of her defiance spread across the table like a battlefield, and the two of them standing in the center of it, not touching in any other way, not speaking, not needing to, because the silence between them had finally changed. It was no longer the silence of absence. It was the silence of 2 people who had just discovered that they were not, after all, alone. He stayed. Not just that night, but the next and the next. He did not return to Hampshire. He moved into the London townhouse as though he had always lived there, which, technically, he had, but which felt, in practice, like a man moving into a country he had only ever seen on a map. He brought nothing with him from Hampshire, except a leather case of personal papers and a volume of Keats that he placed on the shelf in the library, beside Vivian's political essays. And the sight of those 2 things, side by side, the poetry and the policy, the private and the public, felt to Vivian like a declaration more eloquent than any words he could have spoken. He read her notebooks, all of them. He sat at the library table for 2 full days, turning pages with the focused, relentless attention he brought to everything. And he did not speak, and she did not interrupt, because she understood that this was his way of learning her, not through conversation, but through evidence, through the accumulation of facts that added up to a person. On the second evening, he closed the last notebook and looked up at her. She was sitting in the window seat with a cup of tea, watching the lamplit square below. "You did all of this alone," he said. "I had help. Thomas, Mrs. Harlow, Pemberton, though he would deny it, Henry Blackwell, the women themselves. But the work, the investigation, the connections, the strategy." He paused. "That was you." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father used to say that the Sinclair name was like a fortress, built to withstand anything." Another pause. I think he was wrong. I think a fortress is just a very well-organized prison. Vivian set down her tea. She looked at him, this complicated, wounded, magnificent man who was sitting in her library, voluntarily, reading her work, voluntarily, and saying things that cost him everything. And she said, "What happened to you?" She had never asked before. She had never presumed. She had built her understanding of him from fragments, from Thomas's hints, from Pemberton's careful silences, from the annotated poetry on the library shelves. But she had never asked. And she asked now because the door was open, and she did not know how long it would stay that way. Edward looked at her. The candles had burned low. The room was warm and dim, and felt, in that moment, like the safest place in the world. Her name was Catherine, he said, and he told her. He told her about Catherine Ellis, the daughter of a neighboring landowner in Hampshire, who he had loved with the complete, devastating openness of a 20-year-old who had not yet learned that love could be used as a weapon. He told her about the 2 years they had spent together, the walks through the Hampshire countryside, the letters, the poems he had written her, the plans they had made. He told her about his father's fury when he announced his intention to marry her, because Catherine was not wealthy enough, not connected enough, not sufficient for the Sinclair name and the Sinclair legacy and the Sinclair fortress. He told her about the argument that had split the family, Edward on one side and his father on the other, with Thomas caught in the middle, too young to understand and too loyal to choose. He told her about the letter, Catherine's letter, delivered on a morning in November, 3 sentences long. She could not wait any longer. She was marrying someone else. She was sorry. He told her about the years that followed, the years of rebuilding himself from the wreckage, or rather, of building a new self entirely, a self that did not need, did not want, did not feel, because feeling was a door that opened onto an abyss, and he had looked into the abyss and decided that the only safe response was to brick the door shut. He told her about his father's death 2 years later, and the will, the clause that required him to marry or forfeit the estate, and how he had chosen Vivian because her family's situation made her desperate enough to accept an arrangement rather than a marriage, and because he had believed, truly believed, that an arrangement was all he had left to offer. "I married you to fulfill a legal obligation," he said. "I left you in London to be forgotten. I told myself it was the kindest thing I could do, because the alternative was to be close to someone and to fail them the way I failed before." His voice had lost all of its control. It was raw and rough and shaking slightly, and Vivian understood that he had never said these words to anyone, that they had lived inside him like stones in a wall, and now the wall was coming down, and he was terrified of what would be left when it was gone. She stood. She crossed the room. She sat beside him at the table, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she did not speak, because she understood that what he needed was not words, but presence. The simple, physical fact of someone sitting beside him, not leaving, not looking away. After a long time, he said, very quietly, "I did not fail, Catherine. She made her choice. But I could not. I could not forgive myself for wanting, for needing. It felt like the wanting itself was the failure." "It wasn't," Vivian said. "I know that now." He turned to look at her. His eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with the particular shine of someone who has just set down a weight they have been carrying for so long they had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. "I know that because of you." She reached for his hand. She took it. His fingers closed around hers, tight, immediate, as though he had been waiting to hold something and had only just been given the opportunity. Their hands on the table between the notebooks and the candle stubs, his large and warm and trembling slightly, hers smaller and steady and ink-stained. "I'm not going to disappear," she said, "and neither are you." The weeks that followed were a transformation so profound and so quiet that anyone watching from the outside might not have noticed it at all. Edward did not become a different man. He became more himself, more of the man he had been before the fortress, before the silence, before the long years of voluntary exile from his own heart. He began to talk, not constantly, not effusively. He would never be Thomas. But he talked to Vivian over breakfast about the news, and over dinner about her work, and in the library in the evenings about books and ideas, and the particular way the light looked on the Thames at sunset. And each conversation was a brick removed from the wall, until the wall was not a wall anymore, but a window. He began to help. This surprised Vivian more than anything. She had expected tolerance. She had dared to hope for support. She had not expected Edward to sit down at the table with her notebooks and say, "This landlord, Barton, he has debts. I know the man who holds them." She had not expected him to use the Sinclair name, the fortress name, the name that had been built to intimidate and exclude, as a shield for the women she protected and a lever against the men she exposed. He was, she discovered, formidable. Not in the way of a man who shouts or threatens, but in the way of a man who is so precisely informed and so absolutely certain and so terrifyingly patient that his opponents ran out of room to maneuver before they realized they were even in a negotiation. He had spent years managing an estate of 3,000 acres. He understood money and law and the mechanics of power with the same intuitive mastery that Vivian understood people and systems and the human capacity for both cruelty and kindness. Together, they were not twice as effective. They were 10 times. Sir Philip Alderton made his move in February. He did it through Parliament, as Thomas had predicted. A question was raised in the House of Lords about the propriety of a sitting duke's wife conducting what amounted to a private investigation into the business affairs of respectable gentlemen. The word respectable was used 14 times. The word hysterical was used twice. The word dangerous was used once, quietly, by a man in the back row who understood what the others did not, which was that the Duchess of Hargrove was not hysterical at all. She was the most rational person in the room. Edward went to Parliament the next day. He went alone, wearing the black he always wore, carrying nothing. And he sat in the gallery during the session and said nothing while men he had known since boyhood debated whether his wife should be allowed to tell the truth. When the session ended, he walked to Alderton's office. He closed the door. What he said in that office was never reported because Alderton refused to discuss it. But 3 things happened in the week that followed. The parliamentary inquiry was quietly dropped. 2 of Alderton's factories were voluntarily submitted for independent safety inspections. And a cheque for £500 was delivered, anonymously, to a fund for workers injured in industrial accidents. Vivian never asked Edward what he had said to Alderton. She understood that there were parts of him that operated in a language she did not speak, the language of old money and old power, and the silent, brutal negotiations between men who understood that some things were settled not by argument, but by the precise application of pressure to the precise point of vulnerability. She did not need to speak that language. She had her own. But she noted, with the same precision she brought to everything, that Edward had chosen. He had chosen her. He had chosen her work. He had chosen to use the fortress not to protect himself, but to protect her. And the cost, which was real, which was political and social, and measured in dinner invitations not extended and alliances quietly dissolved, he paid without complaint and without regret. Spring arrived. London softened. The trees in Grosvenor Square erupted in white blossoms that fell like snow when the wind stirred them, and the light through the library windows changed from the thin silver of winter to the warm gold of a city waking up. Vivian's network had grown beyond anything she had imagined. There were now over 300 women connected through the system she had built, and the system itself had evolved from a collection of individual placements into something more structured, more resilient, more permanent. She had established a meeting place, a rented hall in Clerkenwell, where women gathered weekly to share information, learn skills, and organize collective action. She had created a fund, supported by anonymous donations that she had solicited through a series of careful, strategic conversations with wealthy women who had more money than their husbands knew and more conscience than society required. She had hired a solicitor, a young woman named Eleanor Graves, who had passed her legal examinations through sheer force of will and who had been unable to find a firm willing to employ her, and who now provided free legal advice to any woman in the network who needed it. The name they had given it, not Vivienne, but the women themselves, was the Ashford Circle. They used her maiden name because she had asked them to, because she wanted it to be clear that this was not the Duchess's charity. It was theirs. And it was changing London. Not dramatically, not in the way that revolutions change cities, with barricades and fire, but steadily, persistently, in the way that water changes stone, by never stopping. Factories were improving their conditions. Landlords were making repairs. Schools were opening. A small but growing number of women were earning enough to live independently, to make choices about their own lives, to walk through the streets of the city that had once erased them and know that they existed, that they mattered, that someone had counted them. It was in April, 1 year after the wedding, that Edward did something that undid Vivienne completely. She came home from a meeting at the Clerkenwell Hall to find the library changed. The table was still there, the notebooks, the map. But beside the window seat, on the shelf where his volume of Keats had sat, there was a new addition. A leather-bound journal, dark green, the exact color of her shawl. She opened it and found, on the first page, in Edward's handwriting, now looser, now alive, the words, "For V, because you showed me that a fortress is not a home." She turned to the page, and there, in his precise but newly fluid hand, was a poem. Not a great poem, not a poem that would be anthologized or studied or remembered by anyone but the two of them, but a poem that was true, that was honest, that was the first thing he had written in years, and that said, in 12 lines, everything he had not been able to say across a dining table, or in a doorway, or in the long months of silence that had preceded his return. She sat on the window seat and read it 3 times. Then she pressed the open journal against her chest and closed her eyes and felt, for the first time since her father lost the house, since the world she had known collapsed and was replaced by this strange, uncharted territory of a marriage that was not supposed to be a marriage, and a life that was not supposed to be a life. The warm, steady, terrifying, glorious sensation of being known. Edward found her like that when he came to the library an hour later. She was still sitting on the window seat, the journal in her lap, and she looked up at him with eyes that were bright and full and absolutely unguarded. And he stopped in the doorway. And for a moment, they were exactly where they had been the first time. Him in the doorway and her in the room. Except everything was different. "You write beautifully," she said. "I write poorly," he said. "But honestly, which I believe you once told me was more important." "I told you that. You told everyone that, at the Clerkenwell meeting last month. I was in the back row." She stared at him. "You were at my meeting?" "I was at your meeting. In a coat I borrowed from Thomas because mine are too conspicuous. I sat in the back, and I listened to you speak to a room of 200 women about the power of documented truth. And I—" He stopped. His voice had gone rough. He cleared his throat. "I understood, in that room, that I had married the most remarkable person I have ever known, and that I had nearly lost her to my own cowardice." Vivienne stood. She walked to him. She stood close, the way she had stood in January, close enough to see his pulse and his tension and his fear. But this time, he was not afraid of her seeing. He was afraid of not being worthy of what she saw. "You didn't lose me," she said. "I nearly did." "Nearly doesn't count." And she kissed him. Not on the forehead, not the way you seal a letter you do not wish to send, She kissed him the way you kiss someone when you have waited a year and a lifetime, and you have finally run out of reasons not to. She kissed him, and he kissed her back, and it was not gentle, not tentative. It was the kiss of two people who had been drowning in their own separateness, and had finally found each other in the dark water, and were holding on with everything they had. When they pulled apart, they were both breathing hard, and the library was still and golden with late afternoon light, and the notebooks were still on the table, and the poem was still in the journal, and the city was still turning outside the windows, and nothing had changed, except everything. "Well," Edward said, and his voice was wrecked and wondering and alive. "That was rather worth the wait." Vivian laughed. She laughed, and it was the sound of a woman who had been told she would be forgotten and had refused, who had been handed silence and made it sing, who had been given an empty house and had filled it with purpose and fire, and now, impossibly, love. The months that followed were the best of Vivian's life, which surprised her, because she had never organized her expectations around happiness. She had organized them around usefulness, around duty, around the fierce, practical imperative to keep moving forward, because stopping meant drowning. But happiness arrived anyway, not as a destination, but as a byproduct, the way warmth is a byproduct of fire, and she found that she could hold both, the work and the joy, the public mission and the private tenderness, without either diminishing the other. Edward had changed, not into someone else, but into himself, the self he had been before the fortress, now older, wiser, carrying the weight of his losses not as a burden, but as ballast, something that kept him steady in high winds. He was still quiet. He would always be quiet. But his quietness had changed from a wall to a room, a space that Vivian could enter, a silence that held warmth instead of emptiness. He sat in the library with her in the evenings, reading while she worked, and sometimes he would look up from his book and watch her without her knowing, and he would feel something so large and so unfamiliar that it took him weeks to name it. It was gratitude, not the polite, performative gratitude of social obligation, but the deep, bone-level gratitude of a man who had been walking through a blizzard and had found, unexpectedly, a door, and behind the door, a fire, and beside the fire, a person who looked up and said, "I've been waiting for you." The Ashford Circle continued to grow. By the summer of 1842, it had become something that could no longer be described as a network or a charity. It was an institution. It had a name, a structure, a fund, a legal advisor, a publications arm that produced a monthly pamphlet detailing conditions in factories and tenements and workhouses, and a growing alliance with sympathetic members of Parliament who had begun to understand that reform was not a threat to their power, but the only thing that could justify it. Alderton tried again. He tried through the press, planting stories in sympathetic papers about the Duchess of Hargrove's radical activities and her corrupting influence on proper social order. He tried through society, orchestrating a campaign of social exclusion that resulted in Vivian being uninvited from 3 balls and a charity gala. He tried through the law, financing a lawsuit against the London Examiner for defamation, a lawsuit that Eleanor Graves dismantled with the surgical precision of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life and had turned that underestimation into a weapon. Each attempt failed, not because Alderton was incompetent, but because Vivian had built something that was not dependent on her alone. It was not a charity run by a duchess. It was a movement sustained by hundreds of women who had discovered that collective action was more powerful than individual desperation, and who were not going to stop because a rich man was uncomfortable. And then Alderton made a mistake. He went after Margaret Hale. Margaret, who had been the first woman Vivian had helped. Margaret, who was now the head seamstress at Madame the Clerk's. Margaret, whose children were fed and housed and safe because a stranger had sat down on church steps and said, "Tell me everything." Alderton's agents approached Margaret's landlord and offered to buy the building she lived in. The landlord sold. The new management tripled the rent. Margaret, who could afford the old rent but not the new, was given a week to leave. It was the kind of cruelty that was technically legal and morally bankrupt. The kind that the visible system of London produced every day without noticing. The kind that had been happening to women like Margaret for generations. But this time, it happened to a woman who was not alone. Within 24 hours, the Ashford Circle had found Margaret new housing. Within 48 hours, Eleanor Graves had filed a challenge to the rent increase on grounds of improper procedure. Within 72 hours, Henry Blackwell had published an article not about Margaret specifically, but about the practice of property acquisition as a tool of retaliation against reformers. An article that named no names, but made every reader in London understand exactly who was doing what to whom. And within a week, Vivian received a note from Alderton himself. It was hand-delivered to the Grosvenor Square townhouse by a footman in livery, sealed with red wax, and it contained a single sentence. "You have made your point, Your Grace." It was not an apology. It was not a concession. It was an acknowledgement, grudging and furious, that Vivian Sinclair, Duchess of Hargrove, the woman who had been married to be forgotten, had become something that could not be ignored, something that could not be silenced, something that the most powerful men in London had to account for when they made their plans. She showed the note to Edward that evening. He read it, his face expressionless, and then he looked at her and said, "Do you know what my father would have called you? Trouble? Dangerous." He paused. He would have been right. Vivian took the note from his hand and tossed it into the fire. They watched it burn together, standing side by side, his arm around her waist, her head against his shoulder. And the flames consumed the paper and the wax, and the petty, vindictive words of a man who had tried to use power the way it had always been used, and had discovered that the world was changing beneath his feet. "I am dangerous," Vivienne said quietly, "but not to the people who matter." Edward tightened his arm around her. "No," he agreed. "Only to the ones who deserve it." 3 years passed. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular fullness of time that is being used well. Time that is filled with purpose and connection, and the small, accumulating moments that make up a life. The Ashford Circle became the most significant social reform organization in London. Its model, women organizing for women, using documented evidence to drive policy change, was adopted in Manchester, in Birmingham, in Leeds. Vivian was invited to speak at events she would not have been admitted to 3 years earlier. She was written about in papers that had once ignored her. She was consulted by parliamentary committees that had once tried to silence her. She was, by any measure, the most influential woman in England, and she conducted her influence with the same calm, relentless precision with which she had once eaten soup at a wedding breakfast, with excellent posture and absolute determination. Edward beside her, always beside her, not in front, not behind, beside. He continued to manage the estate, which thrived. He continued to write poetry, which improved. He continued to attend Vivian's meetings at the Clerkenwell Hall, no longer in Thomas's borrowed coat, but in his own conspicuous black, sitting in the back row with his grey eyes alive and full, watching his wife do the work she had been born to do, and feeling, each time, the same overwhelming gratitude that had taken him weeks to name. Thomas married a woman named Charlotte, who was as warm and bright as he was, and who became Vivian's closest friend, and the four of them spent evenings in the library at Grosvenor Square, laughing and arguing and reading aloud from books they loved, and the portraits of the Sinclair ancestors stared down from their gilded frames, with expressions that had somehow softened from judgment to bewilderment, as though they could not quite understand how their cold, magnificent house had become so thoroughly, irreversibly alive. And on a morning in September of 1844, 3.5 years after the wedding, Vivian stood at the window of the library and looked out at the square, where the trees were beginning to turn gold, and felt a hand on her shoulder, and turned to find Edward, standing behind her with an expression she had never seen on his face. It was joy. Not the controlled, rationed joy of a man who is afraid to feel too much, but the full, undefended, terrified, glorious joy of a man who has finally allowed himself to want everything and has discovered that everything wants him back. "What is it?" she said. He took her hand. He pressed it against his chest, against the place where his heart was beating, steady and strong, and he said, "I have a confession." "Tell me." "I went back and read the contract, the marriage contract, the one I signed in the study with the solicitor in the hall. I remember. It says that I married you to satisfy the terms of my father's will. It says that the marriage is an arrangement of mutual convenience for the preservation of the Sinclair estate." He paused. "It says nothing about love." "No," Vivian agreed. "It doesn't." "I should like," Edward said, and his voice was rough and shaking and full of everything he had spent years refusing to feel, "to amend the contract." She smiled, not the almost smile of the wedding breakfast, not the careful, guarded smile of a woman who has learned to protect herself. A real smile, the kind that starts in the chest and spreads through the whole body and lights up a face from the inside. The kind that is only possible when you have been seen, truly seen, by another person. And what they have seen has been met not with judgment, but with love. "I think," she said, "the contract has already been amended." He kissed her. Gently this time, not the desperate, drowning kiss of the library a year ago, but something quieter, steadier. The kiss of a man who knows he has time, who knows she will be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, who has discovered that love is not a door that opens onto an abyss, but a room that opens onto a garden. And in the garden, there are things growing that he did not plant and cannot control, and would not trade for anything in the world. Outside the window, London turned in the September light, vast and complicated and indifferent, and alive. A city that had a particular way of forgetting women, and that had been forced, by one woman's stubborn, brilliant, dangerous refusal to be forgotten, to remember. 5 years later, a house in Hampshire, the great Sinclair estate, but changed now, the way the library in Grosvenor Square had changed, not structurally, but essentially, in the deep way that a place changes when it is loved instead of merely maintained. The ceilings were still 20 feet high, the portraits still lined the walls, but there were flowers on every surface, and books left open on every chair, and the particular, unmistakable sound of children's laughter echoing through halls that had known nothing but silence for decades. 2 children, a boy named James, who was 4 and had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and a habit of asking questions that no one could answer. A girl named Rose, who was 2 and had her mother's auburn hair and her father's gravity, and a laugh that could fill a cathedral. They were in the garden. Edward was kneeling in the grass beside James, who was attempting to explain something about a beetle he had found, a beetle of extraordinary significance that required immediate and sustained adult attention. Edward listened with the same focused intensity he brought to everything, but his eyes were soft, and his face, that difficult, sharp-angled, distinguished face, was alight with a tenderness so profound that anyone watching would have struggled to reconcile this man with the cold, controlled Duke who had once kissed his bride on the forehead and walked away. Vivian was on the garden bench, Rose in her lap, a book open beside her that she had not read in an hour because Rose had decided that pulling leaves off the hedgerow was more important than literature. And Vivian agreed, because she had learned, over 5 years of marriage and motherhood and relentless world-changing work, that the most important things in life were always the things that interrupted your plans. Thomas and Charlotte were there too, with their own daughter, a bright, chaotic 3-year-old named Lily, who was currently attempting to climb a tree with the determined focus of someone who fully intends to reach the top or die trying. Charlotte was watching her, with the calm resignation of a mother who has learned that some battles are not worth fighting, and some trees are not that tall. Mrs. Harlow had sent out a tea tray. She had retired from the kitchen 2 years ago, but still appeared, without being asked, whenever the family gathered, carrying food and opinions in equal measure. Pemberton was somewhere in the house, managing accounts with the same precise efficiency he had always shown, though he smiled more now, which unsettled the newer members of the staff, who had heard the stories of the old days and could not quite believe them. And in London, the Ashford Circle endured. It had grown beyond Vivian's daily management into an organisation run by the women it served, led by Margaret Hale, who had become its director, a position that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago, and was now simply, unremarkably, real. Eleanor Graves had opened her own legal practice. Henry Blackwell was now the editor of the London Examiner. The pamphlets were still published monthly. The meetings at the Clerkenwell Hall were still held weekly. The work continued, steady and relentless and quiet, the way water continues to shape stone long after the hand that first directed it has turned to other things. Vivian still travelled to London regularly. She still sat at the table in the library at Grosvenor Square, still opened her leather notebook, still listened to women tell their stories, still wrote them down. She had not stopped. She would never stop. But she had learned, over the years, that the most dangerous thing she could do was not to work herself to exhaustion, but to build something that would outlast her, to teach others to do what she did, to make herself, eventually, unnecessary. She had not yet succeeded at that last part. They still called her the most dangerous woman in London. She had learned to accept the title, not as a burden, but as a badge, not as a threat, but as a promise. A promise that the silence would not settle, that the women who had been forgotten would be remembered, that the invisible system would be made visible, one documented truth at a time. On this particular evening, in the garden in Hampshire, with the late summer light falling golden through the oak trees and the children's laughter rising into the sky, and her husband kneeling in the grass with a beetle on his palm, and his son's face turned up to his like a flower to the sun, Vivian closed her eyes and breathed. She thought about the dressing room, the ivory silk dress, the mirror, the woman who had pinned her last curl into place, and decided, in the quiet, unremarkable way that the most important decisions are always made, that she would not disappear. She had not disappeared. She had become the most dangerous woman in London. And she had done it, not with fury or fire or the dramatic gestures that history tends to remember, but with a leather notebook and a steady hand and the stubborn, practical, unstoppable belief that the truth, properly documented and courageously shared, could change the world. Edward looked up from the beetle. He caught her eye across the garden, and he smiled. Not a half smile, not an almost smile, not the faintest relaxation of the muscles around his eyes. A real smile, wide and warm and utterly unguarded. The smile of a man who had locked every drawer in his heart and thrown the keys into a very deep lake, and had watched, in wonder, as a woman in a plain wool coat had waded in and found every single one. She smiled back, and the garden held them, all of them, in the golden light. If you love stories like this, stories of quiet defiance and slow-burning love and the extraordinary things that ordinary courage can accomplish, subscribe and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Share this with someone who needs to hear that being forgotten is not the end of the story. It's the beginning. This story will stay with you long after it ends.